There was this one thing that happened back when I was a kid, and I'll never forget it. Even to this day, I have no idea what I saw and what it meant. Just that it was completely and utterly horrifying. So, to go into the story, at the time I was staying at my uncle and aunt's house. They had a rather large place. They did have 4 kids, and I enjoyed my cousins and staying over there at the house. At the time, I don't recall ever feeling uncomfortable or experiencing anything weird or out of the ordinary, at least until that day. We'd been playing all day long in the woods by the house. Hide and go seek, stick in the mud, all sorts of games. We made tree forts, we built dens, you name it. We played it, so when my aunt set us all off to bed early, not one of us complained. I was staying at the time with my youngest cousin, as he was a really sound sleeper. Literally, after his head hitting the pillow, nothing would wake him. The darn kid could go through a hurricane and not wake up. I'm sure we all know people like that in our lives. They could literally sleep through anything. I, however, was a fairly light sleeper, even more so when I wasn't in my own bed. So, despite having slept there dozens of times, I was still apt to wake at the slightest noise. It was sometime in the very early morning, maybe like 2 a.m., when I was awakened by what sounded like chattering. It isn't very unusual for us to sneak into each other's rooms and wake up in different beds in the morning. I wasn't worried. We were weird like that. But then I could hear my name being called. The strange thing was, it seemed to be coming from outside my window, and it sounded just like my oldest cousin. His name is Luke. Luke, being the oldest, was a bit of a show-off, and was around 9 years old at the time. I thought he had snuck outside, and was trying to be an idiot. "Come out," I heard. So, I quietly crept down the stairs and out the back door. As the room I was in at the time was at the very back of the house, I hadn't noticed my aunt's light was on in her room at the other end. So, there I was, out in the garden, pitch black, aside from the dull light of the moon. And then I see a figure just at the end of the garden. It looked nothing like Luke, unless my cousin had a massive overnight growth spurt and was now 7 feet tall, with long dangling limbs, and what appeared to be some sort of bear skin. I couldn't make out any of the face due to the shadows and poor lighting, but as I stood there in shock, I heard it call my name again, using Luke's voice. It told me to come here. That's when I could hear it more clearly. Even though it resembled Luke's voice, it sounded more crackly, more distorted. The best example I can give you is take a loved one's voice. Now, put their voice through like an AM radio, how it's kind of got that lo-fi distortion to it. That's kind of what it reminded me of, and maybe even being slightly off pitch. I knew in that instant something was wrong. I screamed, ran back into the house, and straight to my aunt. That's where the real Luke was lying on their bed. He was barfing. Since my aunt was busy, my uncle came running over to me, thinking that I guessed that maybe all of his kids ate something bad, and I was about to vomit myself. I felt like it right then, but not due to anything we ate. From total fear, of course. I told him exactly what happened, and he didn't even get mad at me or tell me I was making it up. He calmly told me to wait, and he was going to take a look outside. When he came back in, he tried to assure me it was just a bad dream, or a trick of the light, that maybe even I had a fever going along with my sickness. Well, I wasn't sick, and the following morning, I went back out and looked at the ground. There were tracks. The weird thing was, though, they didn't resemble footprints or shoe prints. or even feet that I was aware of. They kind of looked like hooves, deer hooves, but they looked different. Why was this thing standing at the bottom of the garden? How did it know my name? And how exactly did it copy Luke's voice? Those questions I'll never know. I had a very strange experience when I was driving home one evening. My sister's dog had run away a couple of days prior, and I had promised her that I would drive around after my shift and see if I could spot him in the area he supposedly ran off. That was why I was out in the woods, when I would have much rather been kicking back with a beer after a very stressful shift. So, here I was, driving through crappy old roads with potholes and low-hanging branches, trying to wreck the truck to see if this dumb dog had managed to run off the farm and maybe end up out here. I had my high beams on, driving really slow, window down, calling his name and shining my flashlight out the driver's window as I'm cruising along. I think every animal out there was cursing me right then and there as I drove through, lighting up the forest around me like a darn carnival show. I could hear all sorts of noise and shuffling. Knowing that dog, I'm pretty sure it would respond to being called. Just as I was thinking about that calling it a day would be best, I heard a bark. I immediately stopped the car, called the dog's name again. Then I just listened. I wanted to see if he would respond, and if I could work out just how close he was. Another bark, although it sounded a little off. I reasoned with myself that it had indeed been a couple of days, and he was probably hungry and scared. Then, there was movement in the trees on the passenger's side, and I was just about to open the door and to see if I could get him to come over to the car. I was getting excited when it came tumbling out of the trees. I say it because it wasn't the dog, but whatever this was, I don't even know. It wasn't even a dog. It was around 6 feet tall, if it was standing up. But this was a different thing altogether. It appeared bent over on all fours, but not on hands and knees like a person would be actually crawling. It was on its hands and knees with its feet arched in the air, and it was bony. It almost looked decayed. It had rotten flesh dangling off of it, and I could see its bones and exposed ribcage, and the head was like a mess. Considering the posture and the way it was bent over, the head should have technically been facing the floor, but it seemed to defy basic bone structure, and indeed gravity, as it stretched up, faced forwards, and it looked like a grotesque skull with huge dark open eyes. And then, this thing made a barking noise again, as if it was actually mocking me. I swear, it had this look on its face, as if to say, "Fooled you. You bet I didn't open that door or get out." I knew I didn't want to hang about and see what else that thing was going to do, or what it was capable of. It didn't come any closer. No way was I waiting around. It just stood there watching me as I pulled my car into drive and sped away. I kept checking back in my mirror. Not that I could see much from my rear beams, but it seemed to have not followed me. I drove straight to my sister's. During that time, I had just been checking out monsters in the woods. The dog had just turned back up at the farm. I have no idea what that thing was that I saw, but I can tell you now, there is no way in hell that was from this realm of reality. I believe it was from hell, and not a normal animal. I believe it was messing with me and pretending to be a dog. What can do that? A demon? I don't know. My father at the time had a very small farm. Not a lot of animals, but enough to keep them to earn a small wage and feed the family. Obviously, keeping animals safe, especially the working ones that gave them constant produce, like the cows, sheep, and hens, was incredibly paramount. He and my mother were also kind-natured animal lovers, so there were always cats and dogs running around, and they were always adopting more and more strays. Anytime you saw my dad with a shotgun, though, you would know something would be attacking their precious babies. He would only pull the shotgun as a last resort. He didn't even want to ever go out and shoot a coyote, just because. They would always try and set traps, as if there was a better way, like scaring them off. But predators don't really work like that, at least from my understanding. So, one day, my mom tells me that some of the animals were being spooked. Not necessarily attacked, like physically, but she could tell that each morning they were visibly upset, shaken. Don't ask me how. Apparently, something to do with not producing as much, like maybe the hens were too scared to lay eggs. Anyway, there were also these weird sounds and tracks coming around the barn and pens. Footprints, unlike anything they'd ever seen before. When they looked closer, even the pattern of the prints looked off, like almost as if this creature was coming onto the farm, sometimes on 4 legs, then 2, in no distinct pattern. It was all randomized. It made no sense. They figured it was a person and an animal trying to step over each other's tracks to try and be stealthy. So, they put more traps down to see if they could catch it or them. Now, it might seem strange, but this was really upsetting to them, as they worried for their animals too. And because they're such softies, they were even worried for the creature they were attempting to catch, even if it was one or multiple. So, the very next morning, just before midnight or so, they were awoken by a horrific screaming noise, plus tons of animals going crazy. They come racing down the stairs, my dad grabbing his gun. Dad tells Mom to stay behind when he notices there is something in the trap. They just have no idea what exactly it is. The way he described it is it was almost like a deer. That was the closest they could make it out. But at the same time, they very much knew it was not a deer. He said it was around the size of a mature adult buck, only bigger, and skin and bones. It had fallen over where one of the back legs had gotten stuck in the trap, while screaming, trying to free itself. Have you ever heard a deer scream? Well, I haven't either. My mom and dad stood there in shock, watching it. My dad was contemplating shooting it. He decided that this thing had some sort of disease, or was on its way from dying, just because of how much bone was exposed and rotting tissue it appeared to have. Animal lover or not, that thing wasn't right, and it was really scaring them. The livestock were all going nuts too. As if that wasn't awful enough, the thing that happened next almost gave both of them a stroke. This was a few months ago, and my mother is still terrified about it. Just as my father raised his shotgun, this thing seemed to notice them for the first time. It stopped the dreadful screaming, thrashing, and stared at them. And then it charged. Mom and Dad both said right then and there, right before their eyes, the weird messed up looking not deer changed into a man, in human form, and he was able to reach Day and use his hands to free the leg, which was trapped. Now, that leg should have been all mangled from the jaws of the trap. And okay, it was dark, and they weren't exactly right next to him, but from where they stood, it looked like there wasn't a scratch on him. He then ran off super fast into the woods behind the farm, and as soon as he was gone, the animals all calmed down. My parents didn't sleep at all that night, and ended up hiring local guards that they armed, and put all around their farm on night watch for the few months after this. Well, there's been no sign of him or it since.